Part 2, Images of the Archetypal King. Chapter 3, Historic Images of the Sacred King. Depth psychology infers the existence of archetypes in the collective unconscious, in part by the startling correspondences between the guiding images of very different cultures. These images surface in myths, philosophical and theological speculations, in artistic productions, in scientific achievements, and in institutional and societal designs. Though some disciplines emphasize the differences between cultures, as depth psychologists we, like the sociobiologists and other researchers, are most concerned with similarities. We believe there is an archetypal structure within the collective masculine psyche between both cultural and psychological expressions of kingship. We base our conclusions on the comparative study of world history and evidence from theory and clinical practice of depth psychology, as well as upon the most recent findings in the fields of brain structure research and ethology. The archetype of the king in its fullness involves a structure made up of a number of distinct lines of force. These are coiled in a kind of dynamic cable. The three of these lines of force reveal the presence of the other archetypes we are delineating in this series within the archetype of the king: warrior, magician, and lover. The archetype of the king combines these energies, adds a fourfold dimension of its own, and integrates all of these forces in the nearest approximation of a transpersonal masculine self we can imagine. A man can make his first personal connection with these archetypal forces at any point along one of the several available lines. The task is from there to tap into the other forces in the cable, and finally to integrate all these newly accessed energies into his psyche. The archetype itself is an eternal, a constant construct within the masculine psyche, but cultures vary in the kinds of king energy, which lines of force they draw upon. Some believe their most useful connection is to the king with his fructifying powers. Others summon the king's aggressive military powers. The different king forces a given society taps into demonstrate that society's particular ego archetype configuration. The ancient Egypts, for example, believed every pharaoh to be divine and inviolable. They identified the mortal king with the king archetype. When a mortal king is identified with the king archetype to this degree, he becomes almost always inflated and grandiose, and will likely deprive his people of full selfhood. To the extent that the men in his kingdom believe him to be the unique embodiment of archetypal masculine energies, they are personally deprived of experiencing this embodiment for themselves. A man's blending of human and divine energies is essentially the experience of what we are calling an ego archetype access. A man deprived of the inner experience of himself as the lord of the four quarters in his own right and his own realm is a man impoverished and limited. If a mortal king is not completely identified with the king archetype, he and his subjects have a much better chance at archetypal integration. The ancient Hebrews believed their kings to be mortal, often even foolish. Therefore, their kings were servants, as much as they themselves were, of a transpersonal other in the form of the archetypal king. While all kings, whether identified with the archetypal king or viewed as distinct from the archetype, were servants, the Semitic kings in general and the Hebrew kings in particular were in an advantageous position to exercise servant leadership. If a mortal king, as in this case, is seen in his full humanity and fully distinguished from the archetype of the king, then he and the men in his realm have a much better chance of experiencing themselves in a mature way. Such an experience of ego subordination to the king is a healthy way for men to live their lives. In this ego archetypal access, the ego is able to guide the archetype's enormous energies into creative expression in the world and to receive the life-giving libido of the archetype without being overwhelmed and possessed by it. Of course, not every ancient Hebrew took advantage of the opportunity to infuse his ego with the archetype's life-giving libido. And there were times when his theoretical fallible kings, such as David and Solomon, were accorded almost superhuman status. Similarly, the ancient Egyptian found at times the means to depose his theoretically divine pharaoh. Rather than declaring all pharaohs mortal and thus distinct from the king, the particular offending pharaoh was declared a usurper and a fraud, not a genuine incarnation of the archetype. Hebrew and Egyptian traditions of kingship provide two useful poles to limit our study. Other cultural traditions of the ego-king relationship lie, as well as we will discover, between them. We will focus on these cultural ego archetype axis traditions and not on the history of Dionysic and societal struggles to manipulate the office of the king. The study of the sacred kingship in historical times has a substantial background. The ancient Greek and Roman historians, as well as later medieval, Renaissance, and post-Renaissance theorists, have contributed valuable on-site evaluations of reigning monarchs, as well as elaborate philosophical justifications for and critiques of kingship. Sir James Frazer began the modern comparative mythological and anthropological study of sacred kingship in his now classic work, The Golden Bough. Young also explored the field, fascinated by the question of how such a tenacious and pervasive mythic formulation might manifest in the deep structures of an individual psyche. In The Roots of Renewal in Myth and Madness, the Jungian psychiatrist John Weir Perry demonstrated the dramatic restorative effect the archetype had on the psychological health of severely wounded people. He then turned his attention to a transcultural investigation of the archetype of the king. His book, Lord of the Four Quarters, includes mythological texts about the king gods alongside legends and historical materials about the sacred kings believed to have incarnated the gods of the myths. Mircea Eliade, perhaps the greatest scholar of comparative religion and mythology, has contributed enormously to our understanding of rituals and myths among pre-modern peoples, including the rituals and myths associated with sacred kingship. For pre-modern peoples, Eliade noticed that the sacred dimension of reality was by far their most important mode of experience. This sacred dimension was the locus of what Eliade called the superabundance of divine energy, and existed in the timeless time creation myths speak of, a time above our earthly time. Spatially, the sacred mode was located above and below our earthly plane, in the heavens and in the underworld. The everyday experience of time and space Eliade called profane. Profane time began at the world's creation. Profane space encompassed all those physical locations in the material world never shaped by divine powers, and also those discarded from sacred space by the gods. When sacred time and space erupted into the profane mode, they made the earthly dimension real. Creation was the product of divine energy materializing in the sterile and chaotic profane dimension. Creation for pre-modern peoples began at the center and radiated out in every direction. Eliade found that most of these peoples located the creation site at the center of their territories, where stood a sacred tree, a sacred mountain, the throne or dais of the sacred king, his audience hall, his holiest temple, and by extension his entire capital city. These cities, and the palace temple complexes they enclosed, often were constructed as miniatures of the cosmos. Since they were located at the point where sacred energy had broken into the profane dimension, these locations were believed to carry enormous charges of divine, or in our terms, archetypal energy. Rituals at the temples and palaces were designed to activate or deactivate this energy. The absolute center was conceived of as a radically energized vertical axis, which Eliade called the axis mundi, securing the sacred dimension to the profane. Along this central axis, the divine energies could travel up or down and gain access to the earth plane. Priests and shamans, either by innate psychic gifts or ritual consecrations, could also travel to the heavenly and infernal regions at will. The sacred king was usually the foremost interdimensional voyager. He could constellate the axis mundi wherever he happened to be, by performing religious rituals and ceremonies, or simply by entering into a shamanic trance. He would create the center of the world. It was a sort of portable access. but, especially at times of high ritual, he could, like the characters in the Star Trek series, beam himself up or down along the axis of radiant energy that bound the levels of reality. Whether he was thought of as a divine or mortal, the king's task was to further and steward the creation the gods had entrusted to him. According to Iliade, any time the Axis Mundi was conjured and traversed by the spirit of the king, or his high priest or shaman, the ultimate purpose was always world building. World building accomplished a new transfusion of sacred energy into the profane world, with the resulting regeneration of creation. Without regular transfusions such as these, pre-modern peoples believed the earth plane would degenerate into sterility and chaos. Among the rituals used to secure the sacred energy were seasonal and New Year festivals and the sacrifices, coronations, marriages, and jubilees of the kings. The king's ritual journeys assured as firmly as his governmental and military activities the continued stability and fertility of his kingdom. Traditions of sacred kingship. Africa is a name still fraught with magic. Despite the changes of the modern era, Africa still has the power to conjure images of limitless grassy plains, impassable rainforests, and fantastic beasts. Images too of fierce warrior tribes and their charismatic kings, resplendent in ostrich plumes, leopard pelts, and gold, proud men whose every word was divine law. While such images are increasingly divorced from reality, there was a time not so long ago when the sacred kings of Africa still ruled in wealth and grandeur. They continued the immemorially ancient traditions of kingship of the Neolithic and sub-Saharan peoples. Thousands of years ago, the majestic office of the pharaoh arose from these same traditions. Even today, among the Neolithic and sub-Saharan peoples, we find powerful kings ruling, as did the pharaoh, in seclusion from their subjects. The king is often hedged around by elaborate and inviolable taboos. He may not allow his face to be seen even when he is holding public audience. He must observe a host of daily ceremonies and rituals designed to make of him a veritable god on earth. He is aided by a council of elders, included warriors and statesmen, but closest to his side is the high priest or witch doctor. He is often referred to as a rain king, since his primary function is to assure sufficient rainfall for the crops, herds, and game animals his subjects depend upon. The rain kings achieve their control over the weather, it is believed, through their mystical oneness with all of nature and with their regular communion with the gods. The rain magician, still to be found serving some African tribes, may historically have been the prototype for the African sacred king. The king is regarded as a temporary vessel carrying the power of the divine kingship, what we recognize as the king archetype. When the power begins to fail a king, it is thought that the man's mortal frailty has begun to block the king's energy. The king may hold office only as long as his fructifying power remains within him. Even modern times have seen a failing African king ritually murdered, so that a more vigorous man may be designated as his successor. The early kings of Africa drew on all four of the mature masculine archetypal energies. Besides the evident manifestation of the king, the magician was present when the king invoked the powers of nature for the benefit of his people. The warrior enabled the king to enforce law and order within the realm, and to defend and extend its boundaries. The king's sacred marriage to a primary queen and his taking of a harem were performed as acts of a sympathetic magic designed to draw down the procreative energies of the cosmic lover. Egypt's ancient civilization developed after desertification forced a number of North African tribes to migrate into the Nile River Valley. By 4000 BC, these various tribes had united into two kingdoms, Lower Egypt in the Nile's northern delta, and Upper Egypt in the river valley to the south. Their upper and lower designations are the reverse of what we might expect because they were taken from the direction of the all-important river's flow and not from geographic orientation. Each kingdom was a highly complex, hierarchical, organized society of priests, scientists, engineers, scribes, lawyers, physicians, landholders, merchants, and peasants, presided over by a sacred king. These pre-dynastic kings were credited by the early Egyptians with the creation of civilization. Certainly, archaeological evidence demonstrates that sacred kingship flowered just as the Egyptian social system emerged, and the ancient myths link Osiris, the legendary first sacred king, with the birth of civilization. After teaching the Egyptians all the arts of culture, the god king Osiris was slain by his evil brother Set, who, during his subsequent rule, reversed much of the good work Osiris had done. When Osiris was resurrected from the dead by his wife, the goddess Isis, he became the lord of the dead. Later, Osiris' son Horus defeated Set and restored Egypt to its road to glory. The transition period between Egyptian pre-dynastic and dynastic civilizations witnessed a sudden outpouring of creative intellectual activity. This is the period when the monumental stone temples and monuments were raised, when written languages appeared, and when the fields of medicine, astronomy, and mathematics were codified and extended. 3,000 years later, the ancient Greeks built much of their scientific and philosophical systems on Egyptian foundation. Through the Greeks, our entire Western culture owes a debt to the Egyptian engineering, mathematics, medicine, and theology. Egyptian conceptions of the immortality of the soul, the incarnational character of human being, a last judgment, heaven and hell, the essential unity of God, Madonna and divine child, the Trinity and the Logos, inspired Christian versions of the same ideas. Although other ancient cultures often held such ideas, they are archetypal. Our own understanding of them is built upon the Egyptian. Upper and Lower Egypt were united by 3200 BC by a pharaoh of Upper Egypt, Menes or Narmar, in the first nation-state in history. The traditions of sacred kingship founded by Menes lasted for the next 3,000 years. According to Egyptian belief, the pharaoh was the living incarnation of the high god, Ra, the sun. Ra, the original king god, had given birth to himself at the dawn of creation. From him all the other gods and goddesses and the created world with its myriad life forms had flowed. Ra was the source of life and the sustainer of all things. He had founded the original order, Mat, by which the created world was made and according to which it continued to flourish, both in the realm of nature and in the social sphere. The pharaoh was at once Ra and father and Horus the son. The same Horus was also the son of Osiris, as Ra and Osiris were held to be two aspects of the same divine mystery. Ra lived in the timeless world of the high heavens. Through his son, he maintained life-engendering contact with the things he had made. The pharaoh alone was the conduit for Ka, the life force Ra poured into the world to animate all things. The pharaoh's every action was an expression of the Ma'at, Ra's divine pharaoh order. Ra's first creation was out of chaos, was the primordial hill. Upon this hill sat the pharaoh's throne by the symbolic device of the raised dais. From the pharaoh's throne, the ordered universe radiated in every direction. The Egyptians believed their very souls came from the pharaoh's Ka. He was literally as the point of contact between the human and the divine, the giver of life and the father of his people. He had also, as the raging bull and the wrathful lion, the power to take souls away. He thought Ra's battles against darkness and death, where there was injustice and disorder, the pharaoh brought retribution and the restoration of the Ma'at. As high priest of Egypt, through his harmonious participation with the fabric of Ma'at, he drew upon the power of the magician. He called upon the warrior's energy to defend the citizens of the created world, the Egyptians, against the hordes still ruled by Set, everybody else. Ra also demanded that he extend the boundaries of creation. Thutmose III, the greatest warrior of the pharaohs, pushed Egypt's borders as far as the Tigris and the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia. The lover manifested in the pharaoh's love for his nation. He protected his people from malevolent humans and spirits alike. For the people he was their strong wall and their shady tree. He loved the goddesses through the person of his sacred queen, and with many other wives and concubines besides. It was essential he produce an heir. Besides such a necessary and concrete demonstration of virility and life force, the pharaohs had to celebrate a self-rejuvenation festival called the Hebsed. Through trials of physical endurance, the pharaoh proved he could still serve as a channel of divine energy. Scholars believe this Hebsed festival was a substitute for an earlier tradition of periodical sacrificing the king. Upon his death, the pharaoh ascended to heaven. There he was reunited with Ra, his father. Horus would then incarnate in the air, so continuing the divine presence on earth. Since Ra was also an aspect of Osiris, the pharaoh reunited with him as well, and so became the lord of the dead. Thus he had the power to enable pious Egyptians to live forever beyond the grave. The pharaoh was seen therefore as the benevolent source of life on earth, and beyond the grave as the stern enforcer of divine order. His people looked to him to supply their every need, and he was the individual uniquely empowered to provide for them. Originating in the Caucasus region of Western Asia, the Indo-Aryan diffusion spread by a series of invasions, a group of tribes throughout India, Iran, the Near East, and Europe. These invasions began in the second millennium BC. Descendants of the conquerors include the Greeks, the Romans, and the Teutonic peoples. All the Indo-Aryan groups drew heavily on warrior energy. All organized their societies under warrior kings in rigid hierarchies of professions and classes. The magician also figured effectively in their elaborate theological systems and their various sciences and technologies. India, fabled land of desert and jungle, of tigers and elephants, of golden palaces and garden-festooned temples, has cradled in her valleys some of the world's foremost religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, and Jainism. From this home of sophisticated metaphysical and theological traditions, India's spirituality spread throughout the Mediterranean area during the 4th century BC, the time of Alexander the Great. Indian thought was a major influence on the pre-Socratic philosophers of Greece and through Plotinus on the theology of the Christian Church. India's gods are legion: Indra, Varuna, Krishna, Rama, Vishnu, Shiva, Brahma, king gods, all of them, providing, protecting, and procreating in myth and legend. It is they who engender divine order, dharma, in the events of the material universe. In pre-modern times, the Indian rajas were believed to be composed of particles of the gods. A raja was the living embodiment of dharma. The souls of all living things were drawn upward in the spiritual dimension through this sacred king, the people's holy vessel. Though theoretically the Raja could betray his divinity, transgress against Dharma, and be deposed, some Indian commentators insisted that the king's divinity was so entire that he could flout human conventions with impunity. For these apologists, even the Raja's cruelest and most abusive actions were expressions of a godly nature. He was titled, as were the gods, the Lord of the Four Quarters. Through his every word and deed, the Raja was inextricably bound to the fructifying and desolating powers of nature. He was the unique source of life and blessing, of rain and abundance for his people. He was also their source of eternal life and their wrathful judge. Because his person was a holy vessel of divine energy, he had to be sealed off from the profane dimension of the earthly plane. His daily life was bound by ritual, serving to isolate, conserve, and contain his sacred powers. He could not touch the ground with his bare feet, lest his divine energy immediately drain from him. To his subjects he was both high priest and military leader, whose dharma filled him with radiance, and whose battlefield prowess knew no equal. Persia's king sat on a golden throne, ornamented with richly worked tassels, fringes, and purple silk cushions. Around his head burned the holy flames of the supernatural Exarna, and above him the winged sun dusk of Ahura Mazda, the creator god of light and fire, flashed a warning to any agent of darkness who might be seeking to destroy the creation. His Persian empire centered in what is now Iran, and in its height stretched from Mongolia to Egypt, and from Arabia to the shores of Greece. The Persian king wore a veil in order to protect his subjects from the fiery effulgence that emanated from him. He was the holy container of Kasharta, the charism of rule, and he dedicated his life to the overthrow of demons and all their impious works. The Persian monarchs were heirs of Mesopotamia and Egyptian civilizations and converts to the Zoroastrian faith. Their veracity was a symptom of their determination to recreate the world through an injection of Ahura Mazda's light and truth into the tarnished dimensions of space and time. The earthly battles were echoes of the profound struggle fought on all levels of sacred space and time between the forces of light and darkness. At the end of history, these kings were destined to fight side by side with the heavenly Savior and share in the triumph of good over evil. Teutonic tribes were among the Indo-Aryan warrior nations to share in the conquest of Europe from the 6th century BC through the 6th century AD. In the process, they subdued or displaced the Celts and other peoples of Central, Southern, and Western Europe. These barbarians, as the Dorian Greeks termed the bearded Teutonic hordes, invaded the Mycenaean city-states and eventually joined with the natives in establishing the culture of classical Greece. They conquered Italy and founded Rome. Later still, they engineered the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West, settling afterward in the cultural spheres that become the modern nations of much of Europe. The Vikings were one of the notorious Teutonic tribes, whose campaigns reached as far as Moscow, and who founded the Russian nation. Among these tribes, too, were the Anglo-Saxons, who took Britain back from the Romans, driving the Romanized Celts into Cornwall and Wales in the process. Much later, various amalgams of these people, the Normans, the French, the Dutch, and the Germans, through the colonial policies profoundly altered the geopolitical situation of the planet. The early Anglo-Saxons believed in a sacred kingship very similar to that of their cousins in Iran and India. The Anglo-Saxon king was held to be descended from Wotan, or Odin, the high god of the Teutonic pantheon. Wotan would be wise and kindly, but had also a fierce and militaristic aspect, strongly paralleling the other king gods found throughout Indo-Aryan and Semitic cultures. Descended from Wotan, an Anglo-Saxon king was believed to be filled with Wotan's creative powers and destructive might. The sacred king was the warrior chief of his people. Because of his divine ancestry, he was also the high priest. Through ecstatic communion with his divine ancestors, he assured the well-being of his realm. He was in mystical communion with the forces of nature. He called his divine energy luck, a cognate of Iranian Kustortar. As his luck went, so went his kingdom. In the earliest times, when his luck failed, he was sacrificed, and a new, luck-bearing man from the sacred kin was elected. After his death, the king became a god. In the sacred dimension beyond the grave, he continued to care for his people. A little reverie allows us to picture what his posthumous contact may have been like. Imagine a morning sunrise through the tangled trees of a northern forest, rousing the spirits of the beasts, lighting the broken grasses along a path to a man-made hill. Asleep in his barrow is the king, entombed with his iron weapons, his chariot and horses, an amber pendant, and a boar-tusk necklace. Though the body of the king rests, his soul is alive in the forest. It speaks in the wind, it shouts in the thunder, It cups the waving grain in invisible hands, urging it to grow. At the barrow, when his son comes with the priests and the whole folk to do him honor, the soul of the king whispers in his son's ear, uttering oracles concerning future triumphs and impending disasters. A god now, the sacred king guides his people with all of his accumulated wisdom and the strength of his supernatural will. When we move from the Near East and Europe to Central Asia, we move into magician territory. The kings of Asia turned the warrior's virtues of emotional detachment and rigorous self-discipline inward in order to achieve a continual state of communion with the spirit world. The remainder of the warrior energies these kings split off and vested into various ministers at the royal court. The sacred king in these countries has been otherwise entirely encompassed by the magician and the lover in his spiritual aspect. He lives his life at a distance from the world and in intimate union with the Buddha's essence of mind. Tibet saw the emergence of sacred kingship in the 7th century AD. The king soon found his claims to divinity supported by the Buddhist religion, which was making headway against the native Bon faith at this time. The Tibetan king was the Dharmaja, the embodiment of the sacred order on the earth plane. And yet he had little to do with the actual governance of his people. The administrative and military duties were delegated to powerful functionaries, and priests saw to the people's high religious needs. The Tibetan king was expected to live his life as a holy ascetic, unaffected by the affairs of profane reality and beyond all feminine charms. Only so long as he could sustain his monastic ideal would the rains fall and the people prosper. If the king's Mangatang became corrupted, drought would follow and the kingdom would perish. Fresh mortal vessels for the incarnation of Dharma were always provided by a ceremonial system that sacrificed the reigning king when his heir turned 13. The coronation ritual following returned to the world to the untainted state it had been in when fresh from the hands of the gods. Upon his death, the former ruler became a divine ancestral spirit. He continued to live on in the person of his son. All deified Tibetan kings became one with the mythological ancestor king. It was said the ancestral king, lost in the mists of prehistory, and descended from the land of light in order to inaugurate the rule of Dharma in the created world. The intricately worked mandalas of Tibetan Buddhism are hypnotic images of the sacred center their kings were expected to hold. Around this still point swirl gods and goddesses, angels and demons, saints and sinners, and the whole of the created world. At the center all is harmony and bliss, resolved into the tranquil light of Buddha consciousness. China's divine emperor was called the unique man. His physical and spiritual person was again the universe's center. In the Chinese character for emperor, he is represented as the vertical axis mundi, holding together the earthly and heavenly planes. The Son of Heaven, he ruled by the mandate of heaven. As the supreme embodiment of the sacred center, the emperor ruled a created world that expanded intricately on every side in Chinese box fashion. His palaces and temples were built to duplicate in miniature the structure of the universe. The sacred city around the palace-temple complex was a further replication of the cosmos. The rest of the kingdom drew its sustenance from this center and extended the divine presence to the limits of profane in space and time. Beyond its borders were chaos and death. The Chinese regarded themselves as the true people, imbued with an overflow of te, or life force, which their emperor shared freely with them. As high priest, the emperor performed sacred seasonal rituals in the Hall of Light, where the te was concentrated. From the central hall, te was distributed just as ma'at and dharma were distributed among all living things in the kingdom. On Taishan, the holy mountain, the emperor was ceremonially sacrificed through an unfortunate proxy and then resurrected. By this sympathetic magic, the whole universe returned to its original chaos and then was regenerated. The emperor's power was renewed so that he could pursue heaven's command to defeat the forces of chaos and extend the boundaries of the created world. Within the borders of the Chinese world, the emperor brought abundance, fertility, joy, and peace to all of his subjects. He manifested both mercy and wrath, reflecting his sacred moods, the benevolent and wrathful seasons in the cosmic order. Huang Ti, the Yellow Emperor, was the mythological paradigm for succeeding historical emperors. According to legend, he was conceived by a concubine who happened to glance up into the sky as a bolt of lightning flashed toward the constellation of the Great Bear. Huang Ti dedicated himself to scholarship and reflection, drawing upon the magician energy that came to characterize Chinese kingship for 3,000 years. His magic power came from the learning the secret harmony of all things, by obeying the mystical numbers that govern the dynamics of heaven and earth. He established cosmic order in China, and in so doing made civilization possible. He was firm and just and embraced the whole world. Nature conformed to his wishes, and through him abundance was offered to the Chinese people. After he had reigned 19 years and his kingdom was at peace and prospering, Huang Ti heard that the great sage Huang Kanzi was living on the summit of a sacred mountain near the capital city. Huang Ti made a pilgrimage to learn from Huang Kanzi. He explained he hoped to learn to direct the yin and the yang so as to secure the comfort of all living beings. Huang Kanzi instructed the emperor in the mysteries of the yin and the yang, the masculine and feminine energies of the universe, and other mysteries of the Tao, the way of things that underlay the Te. Huang Kanzi taught the emperor that he could accomplish all things solely through attention to his own inner psychological and spiritual condition. The Taoist ideal proclaimed that all things would work together in harmony as long as the emperor's own inner life was harmoniously ordered. This Taoist concept makes a certain degree of sense in terms of the conclusions of depth psychologists. On the basis of extensive evidence, it seems that our outer worlds do reflect back to us the dynamics of our inner lives and the persons and events we encounter. Korea's Pak Hoi-Kos, the man who rules by light, agreed to take the form of a human being and descend to Earth in order to establish civilization among the peoples of Korea. He dropped to Earth at the foot of the sacred mountain and founded the Silla kingdom. As he touched the ground, the birds and animals began to dance. The sun and moon shone brightly than they ever had before, and the earth shook for joy. The whole mountain shone in the radiance that enveloped him. He set up the sacred kingship of Korea and taught the people his divine knowledge of agriculture, mathematics, government, written language, science, the trades, and the arts. Japan's samurai tradition was brought fightingly home to the American sailors who watched the wave after wave of kamikaze pilots slamming their explosive-laden planes into the decks of U.S. warships. These young Japanese seemed completely out of their minds to the Americans, but to their countrymen they were heroes, inspired by the self-sacrificial ideals of samurai of medieval Japan. They followed the emperor's behest to spread the light of the rising sun beyond the borders of Japan. Their white flags, central image of a blood-red dawn sun, rays flashing outward to vanquish the darkness of the rest of the world, symbolized their holy cause. Japan's kingship ideology reached full expression between the 4th and 8th century AD. The first divine emperor, Ojin, established his rule at Naniwa near Osaka. He and his descendants were referred to as children of the high shining sun. To the Japanese, the sun was the god of enlightenment, life, and cosmic order. By the 8th century, Japanese emperors were believed to be incarnations of the sun god. The emperor was given the title Akitsu mi Kami, the sun who has manifested himself in the phenomenal world as a human being. As god kings, the emperors became the supreme mediators between the human and the divine. One of the emperor's most important duties was to annually distribute the sacred rice seed, which initiated the planting season. This ceremonial action was both a symbolic and tangible expression of the life-bearing powers. Closely associated with the emperor were ministers who specialized in either military or religious matters. Over these formative centuries, a vast bureaucracy was developed on the Chinese model. As in China, the emperor became a sage king who fostered the growth of a large intellectual elite. His palace was the sun's center in the world, and from it he beat back the forces of darkness. His enthronement signaled the recreation of the universe. Maya civilization, at its height from approximately the 1st century BC to the 10th century AD, arose in the context of enormous creative energies unleashed by the emergence of the sacred kingship. The Maya built vast stone cities in the steaming jungles and huge palaces and soaring pyramids topped with ornately decorated roof cones. A profoundly mystical attitude toward time was characteristic of the Maya, who could calculate unimaginably distant dates in a pre-human past. Efficient, stratified societies, flourishing arts and sciences, and innovative agricultural technologies were also theirs. Their temples, the collective conception of priests, archetypes, astronomers, and engineers, were designed to be microcosms of a multidimensional universe. The temples served for the Maya as the power centers for whose function was to raise the sacred life force and then ritually distribute it for use throughout the kingdom. The sacred Maya king was a ceremonial conduit for this power. Again, through a reverie, we can combine pieces of archaeological testimony into a vivid scene. On the pyramid platform, high above the surrounding jungle before the door to Jabala, the underworld, the king pierces his tongue with a stingray spine. He then draws a rope through the perforation. He catches his blood in a bowl of paper scrolls, so that when the scrolls are burned, he can behold the visioned serpent in the rising smoke. For the visioned serpent's mouth, the heads of his divine ancestors appear. Trembling with the force of energy of the world tree as constellated, the king hears the voices of the gods. They speak perhaps auspicious words about the war he will soon have to fight to secure noble captives for temple sacrifices. The king's Quetzal feathered headdress and jaguar robe signal his divinity to all. Through his magical acts and his military prowess, he regenerates to a dangerous world. He is high priest of the sun, commander-in-chief of the warriors, administrator, judge, and architect. His kingdom's welfare depends entirely upon him. As divine, his word is the word of the ancestor kings with the gods. A giant invisible jaguar spirit rears behind his throne, a deadly threat to anyone who might doubt this Ahu is protected by the unseen world. Through the king, the realm of the gods and demons can work its will, for good and evil, upon all the life forms of the earthly dimension. Central Mexico, far to the north, supported the great civilizations first of the Toltecs and later the Aztecs. These peoples emerged from the same cultural horizon as the Maya had, though recent research indicates that the Maya were more warlike than had previously thought. By contrast with their northern cousins, they were a peaceful people. The sacred kings of central Mexico were aggressively militant. The Aztecs had an especially insatiable appetite for empire building, all-out warfare, and human sacrifice. Kingship among the Aztecs developed slowly out of a tribal democracy in which the earliest kings were the first among equals, addressed simply as Reverend Speaker. The Reverend Speaker, though human, was seen as the chief intermediary between the Aztec people and their high gods. Huitzilopochtli and Tonatiuh, just prior to Cortez's arrival in Mexico, Aztec kingship was transforming into the kind of sacred kingship we have already surveyed. Moctezuma II, Zuma to the Spaniards, demanded he be treated like a living god. This seemed outlandish to many of his subjects, but they were in no position to refuse him. Behind central Mexican kingship lay legends of an ancestral god king, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. The Toltec priest kings who succeeded him and incarnated his spirit took on his name as well. He had established and ruled the primordial city, Tolan. Tolan had been laid out from a central pyramid plaza under Quetzalcoatl's guidance in the directions of the four quarters of the universe. Quetzalcoatl taught the Mexicans all the arts and sciences and the customs and laws of civilized life. Prior to this, Quetzalcoatl had created the fourth age in the history of the world. As his crowning achievement, he made human beings. He had done this by an act of self-sacrifice. He died in order to journey to the underworld, where he stole the sacred bones he needed to make the first people. He sprinkled the bones with his own blood, drawn from his phallus, until they came alive. He then resumed his life in the land of the Toltecs, enjoying being king to his new creations. He taught his subjects how to harmonize their society with the cosmic order revealed in the mysteries of the calendar. A great warrior, he extended Tolan's sphere of influence in every direction. He gave to every human being at birth an immortal soul. He journeyed at the end of his reign to the Gulf Coast, setting sail for the rising sun after vowing someday to return. But even after his earthly departure, Quetzalcoatl continued to nourish his creation. As the Mexican poet said, "Truly it began with him, truly from him it flowed all art and knowledge." Peru was home to the aggressive Inca people. Inca actually was a title for their emperor, and their first Pachacutec began an amazing period of expansion. Beginning in AD 1438, the Incan armies carried their conquests all the way to the Colombian-Ecuadorian border and to central Chile. Not only a great warrior, Pachacutec personally redesigned and renovated Cusco, the capital city. He initiated ambitious building projects and reorganized Inca society in a hierarchy of trades and professions. Under the leadership of succeeding Incas, the people advanced the sciences of metallurgy, medicine, architecture, and engineering. They built a network of roads and bridges connecting all the cities of the empire. They found an efficient postal service, and delivering messages through a language of knotted cords. The Inca was believed to be the child of the sun. His word was the will of the gods. Like most of other sacred kings, he possessed a large harem. His many sexual liaisons were magic acts encouraging the universe to rain abundance and bliss down upon the peoples of his empire. The sacred king, as mortal man and servant of the archetype. Up to this point, we have been looking at kings who, at least in theory, were incarnations of the king archetype. In societies we've examined, little distinction has been made between the mortal king's ego and the archetype. The two were more or less merged. Beliefs about the king's divinity were remarkably uniform, where the kingship emphasized magician or warrior energy, and whether the lover was celebrated in his erotic or in his spiritual ascetic aspect. In every case, the mortal king, reigning at what was believed to be the center of the cosmos, manifested the creative ordering of the earthly level of reality. His world-building affected the rise of great civilizations. His procreative powers were held to assure the flourishing of life in his kingdom. Now we turn to the other pole of the phenomenon of kingship. The pole is typified by a radical disidentification of the mortal king's ego from the archetype of the king. Mesopotamia relief sculptures from the palaces of ancient Assyria portray their kings Ashur-bani-pal, Shalmaneser, Tiglath-Pileser, and others, attired in scaled body armor and intricately worked crowns. They swing their swords or draw their bows from horseback or from chariot, thighs and biceps bulging with effort. Their expressions are an odd combination of fierce intensity in the eyes and ethereal, tranquil smiles. These all-conquering muscular giants with long curled beards and flowing oiled tresses are representations of the dynamic calm that is a hallmark of the king energy. Their eyes pierce friend and foe alike. Their hands are swift, their movements sure, and their enigmatic smiles are hints of a supreme self-confidence. A winged sun disk above their heads figures the high god, Ashur, guiding them in the cosmic combat of light against darkness. Scholarly controversy surrounds the attempt to understand sacred kingship in Mesopotamia. Some scholars argue for similarities to Egyptian beliefs and practices, emphasizing a number of ancient texts that suggest the Mesopotamian kings were regarded as incarnation of king gods. Others point to what they believe are considerable differences between the two traditions. In Mesopotamia, they argue, the mortal king was considered the servant of the king god, not his incarnation. Mesopotamia geography determined a very different culture from the one developed by the Egyptians. Egypt's geographic isolation gave her relative security from invasion. Dependable annual floods brought fertile soil from the interior of Africa and ensured flourishing crops. This led to the spiritual optimism that characterized Egypt's outlook and religion. Between the Tigris and the Euphrates River, Mesopotamia was situated on a great plain which was extremely vulnerable to marauders from the mountains to the northeast and the deserts of the south. The elements were as violent and insecure as neighbors. Mesopotamia religion reflected a pervasive sense of insecurity in its preoccupation with demons, magic charms, and exorcism. The gods were angry and cruel, often for no good reason. The cosmos was constantly on the verge of being overwhelmed by chaos and death. The combat myth, present in most spiritual traditions around the world at some level, was a central part of the Mesopotamian mythology. World-making was of paramount importance, to be pursued continually and with the utmost vigor. The people looked to their priests and magicians, their armies, and, above all, their kings in a never-ending struggle to affirm life against the forces of destruction. The basic symptom of government in Mesopotamia seems to have been village democracy. The earliest kings were elected from town councils and served only in times of crisis. This city-state culture predated the rise of civilization in Egypt by some 500 years. By about 3500 BC, the Sumerians of southern Mesopotamia had developed a highly sophisticated civilization with monumental architecture, written language, refined arts and sciences, social stratification, and a complex philosophical understanding of the world. A permanent city-state kingship was established eventually out of military necessity. In the 24th century BC, the kingdom of Akkad, just to the north of Sumeria, succeeded in conquering much of the Tigris-Euphrates valley, and the first Mesopotamian nation-state came into being. With it came sacred kingship. Sargon of Akkad, the conqueror, called himself "He who rules the four quarters," a title previously reserved for the highest god. Sargon's son made a direct bid for divinity by styling himself king of the four quarters. By the time of Hammurabi, Babylon's most famous king, the claim of divinity seems to have been dropped. On the stele proclaiming his code of law, Hammurabi pictured himself as the faithful servant of Shamash, god of the sun. Hammurabi stands before Shamash's throne in an attitude of contemplation. Shamash, gesturing with his right hand, imparts the sacred laws to the king. Henceforth, the Mesopotamian kings were seen more as anointed servants of the king gods than as incarnations of the king archetype. The sacred king was still, however, the chief mediator between divine and human modes of reality. While he may have been mortal, he was still the god's chosen adoptive son. The urban center the king presided over was laid out as a miniature universe and oriented toward the four quarters. The palace was often attached to the temple. The king was the chief priest. On certain holy days, only he could ascend to the top of the ziggurat to commune in the summit temple, alone with the gods. At such times, the king came before the divine presence on the holy mountain as the representative of all humankind. At other times, such as the New Year festival, when the epic of creation was recited, he represented the Babylonian god Marduk in his struggle with the great dragon of chaos, Tiamat, and his subsequent creation of the world. This partial identification of king and god implies at least some merging of ego and archetype. Mesopotamian kings were the codifiers of divinely inspired laws ancestral to the Hebrew Torah. Babylonian and Assyrian kings were the patrons of huge libraries and of the arts. But while the magician energy was a powerful influence on Mesopotamian kingship, the warrior force was even more powerful, especially in Assyria. While the Assyrian kings are occasionally sculpted performing religious ceremonies, they are most usually shown in military guise. We see them leading lion hunts or mowing down their human enemies. These warrior exploits were admittedly religious to some extent in this cultural context, as they symbolized the king's victory over chaos and death. We find a nearly identical conception of sacred kingship in those urban centers that drew their primary inspiration from Mesopotamia, mainly the kingdoms of Asia Minor, Syria, and Palestine. Among the Hittites of Asia Minor, especially after the Indo-Aryan incursion, there are hints that the king may have been considered divine. He appears in relief sculptures with the symbols of the gods and the procreative powers, among them the winged sun disk and the tree of life. In Hittite literature, he was given the title Image of God, and it was claimed he was descended from divine parents. But more usual epithets were beloved of the god, hero, and the anointed one, all of which suggest his unique yet human nature. In pre-Hebraic Palestine, Mayor kings ruled over a host of tiny cities. As in Mesopotamia, they appear to have been as servants and adopted sons of the high god, whom they knew as El Elyon. In the great religious festivals, the kings represent Baal, El's son. Temporarily, at least, they thereby assumed a divine identity. The Hebrews originated, some biblical scholars believe, from among the loosely confederated tribes working as merchants and mercenaries in the lands between Egypt and Mesopotamia. They assimilated elements of Egypt's culture during the Egyptian sojourn of the Jacob clans and in their subsequent wanderings through Egyptian Palestine. But they always showed a stronger affinity for Mesopotamian culture. Indeed, their legendary founder, Abraham, was said to have come from the 2nd millennium BC Babylonian kingdom. Once the famous 12 tribes coalesced and occupied parts of Palestine, they felt the need for a king. Each tribe had been ruled over by a petty chief, or judge, but military necessity impelled the election of a primary king. From the beginning, it was clear that a Hebrew king was a mortal man, destined to remain in office only so long as the high God Yahweh and his spokesmen, the prophets, remained pleased with him. Hebrew kings resembled their Mesopotamian counterparts. They were the acknowledged servants of the high God and the chief intermediary between God and people. Where a Hebrew king possessed power to influence the earth's fecundity and his people's welfare, it came largely from enforcement of and adherence to the laws of Yahweh. Yahweh responded to moral rectitude and personal piety, not ceremonial magic or attempts at mystical identity with him. However, it does seem that the elements of Canaanite kingship persisted in Palestine and influenced segments of the Hebrew people. Other sources corroborate biblical evidence that the northern kingdom of Israel incorporated the fertility rituals of Baal and his queen, Anath, into the religion of Yahweh. Yahweh was even called Elohim in the north after the Canaanite high god. There was another sense in which Hebrew traditions resembled divine kingship practices. The Hebrew law, the Torah, which upheld, produced much the same effect as the Ma'at and the Dharma. The king's personal adherence to the Torah had at least the near magical effect of ensuring the fertility of nature and well-being of his subjects. In later years, King Solomon, who permitted the worship of the aboriginal gods, was believed by the Hebrews to have a great magician, capable of constellating Yahweh's powers at will. For the most part, the Hebrew kings were in a very different relation with the king archetype than were the kings of Egypt, Asia, or of the New World. What we see in the Hebrew kingship is a radical disidentification of the king's ego from the archetype. The Hebrews knew the full archetype only in the guise of their sky-dwelling god. Yahweh is comparable to the other king gods, such as Indra, Zeus, and Ahura Mazda. He was regarded as the origin of the divine order under which all living things flourished. He was firm in his requirements that his chosen people adhere to his order as expressed in the Torah. He was the source of fertility and good fortune. Through a gradual theological development, this former volcano god developed in the Hebrew imagination into the sole creator of the universe. He subsumed within himself, through the efforts of the biblical authors, the attributes and functions of many preceding gods and goddesses. He loved and cared for all peoples because his sacred utterances had called all of them into being, not just the people of Israel. At the same time, his justice could be severe. He ruled his world with an iron hand. Yahweh was the source of enormous creative and destructive power. Mere mortals could not behold him and live. Though Yahweh was at first suspicious of urban civilization, the kings who reigned in his name were not. David and Solomon renovated and enlarged many of the former Canaanite cities, particularly Jerusalem. Yahweh's Ark of the Covenant was moved into Jerusalem, and because of this city became for the Hebrews the center of the world. The one important area in which Yahweh fell short of manifesting the archetypal king was in his relationship to feminine energies. Like a handful of other austere gods, among them Persia's Ahura Mazda, Yahweh had no queen. He did not incorporate some of the traditionally defined feminine characteristics, relatedness, compassion, tenderness, mercy, the need to love and be loved. But Yahweh and the Semitic high gods who evolved from him, Allah and the Christian Trinity, ruled alone. We believe this aversion to accepting the feminine and the woman who embody it has impoverished the entire experience of the divine in the Western religions. The cult of the Virgin Mary was one spirited, popular attempt to redress the imbalance. An odd thing happened shortly after the death of the Jewish prophet Jesus 2,000 years ago. The early Christians transformed Jesus into the archetype of the king. Never having known the man, they vested in him the structures and dynamics of the king gods from their non-Hebraic heritages. Many early Christians came from the religious backgrounds that included the sacred king traditions of ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome, as well as Hermetic influences, the mystery religions, and the Persian religions of Zoroastrianism and Mithraism. The myths of these various faiths were replete with king gods, even where actual sacred kings were a thing of the distant past. Jesus was soon considered a god incarnate, born of a mortal woman divinely impregnated, like Osiris in the Egyptian myth. He had been slain by his evil brother called Satan by the early Christians. Again, like Osiris, Jesus Christ had then been resurrected and become ruler of the dead. After his sacrifice, Jesus did just what the ancient pharaohs had done, ascending into the heavens and becoming one with the high God. According to Christian myth, Jesus was the creative word of God, like the word of the Egyptian god Plah, the agent by whom the high God created the universe. He became the teacher of a new kind of civilization, based on an inner balance. He thereby served as had other law-giving civilization founding king gods and sacred kings as the embodiment of cosmic order and as the focal point from which that order radiated into the creative world. On earth, he had been a great healer. He had magical power over the forces of nature. Like the Taoist emperors of China, he acted often through inaction. By merely ordering his inner being, he allowed his divinely Father to act through him. He had emptied himself of the fullness of his divine prerogatives, like Koreans Pak Hyakos, and descended to this earthly plane in order to bring human beings the divine light by which they could live in harmony. He had been the high priest, the supreme mediator, and the ultimate sacrifice. From a depth psychological point of view, the Christological controversies of the first 3 centuries of our era stemmed from attempts by theologians to understand the proper relationship between the human ego and the archetype of the king. We can see an unconscious depth psychology at work. Those who argued Jesus was a god and not a man were, like the ancient Egyptians, identifying the human ego with the king energy. Those who argued he was a man, not a god, were, like the Hebrews, distancing the ego from the archetype. In the end, most theologians compromised with theories of coherence between the human and the divine. These early Christian thinkers unconsciously respected the psychological fact that the ego and the archetype are 2 independent aspects of a total psychic system. The 2 are distinct from one another, with the ego, Jesus Christ the Son, subordinate to the archetype, God the Father, but paradoxically essential to it and sharing the same psychological substance with it. An excellent film to watch in light of these issues is Martin Scorsese's The Last Temptation of Christ. Irrespective of any cinematic value the piece might have, it gives an excellent record of these issues. The basis of the film is that the man, Jesus, doubts his divine kingship, while his followers want him to accept it. Jesus can't shrug off the king projections his disciples try to give him, but he doubts the origin of inspiration, the nature of his calling, and the necessity of his sacrifice. Many men are dismayed by the idea of willing sacrifice. The important attribute of the king archetype strikes many as unnecessary, even masochistic. Jesus himself tries out this view in a long sequence at the end of the film, after being offered an easy way out of his crucifixion. Once he fully understands the consequences of evading his suffering, though he chooses to go through with it, and so he is crucified. He constellates the axis mundi, and so makes of himself a conduit for pouring sacred energy into the profane world. This is the intention behind the ritual and symbolic sacrifices we've examined. When the sacrificial king offers himself up, he takes upon himself the task of remaking the world, but only when he knows this is the only means he has to achieve this. A man who unconsciously sacrifices himself for his family is an ineffective sacrifice. He is unconsciously identified with the king. Here is the distinction between the masochist and the mature man. Jesus would prefer to avoid a painful death, but when he understands the circumstances that demand his death, he accepts it. He draws upon the king energy of stewardship, extending the bounds of his responsibility to where his responsibility truly ends. Imagine for a moment if a man in our society were to do this. Imagine the oil company executive who makes a concerted effort to clean up the environmental damage his company has caused, because he recognizes and accepts the extent to which his company is responsible. Imagine the husband who gives his wholehearted support to the realistic wishes and plans of his wife and children, not only because he is fond of them, but he has accepted his responsibility for them. And what if a president were to make reparation for his mistakes and the mistakes of his predecessors? Is such a scenario even imaginable? What if, instead of asking us to put on a brave face and forget these mistakes, he were to lead us in a national period of mourning? If these possibilities seem outrageous, it is because of the extent to which we are used to projecting our king onto others. It is much easier to deny our responsibilities when accepting them would so disrupt our habits of life. Our company is ruining the city's water supply. I really wish the CEO would do something about it. I'd better not say anything, though. It's none of my business. The man who is really accessing the king makes the social ills that trouble him his business. Most of us are so desperate to evade our social responsibilities will go so far as to elect presidents who are the perfect image of our cowardliness, the Teflon men who gladly accept the king projections as a nation offers them, but who accept responsibility for little else, especially on the domestic front. And the cycle keeps turning on in itself, because whenever we project our king onto a politician or anyone else, we feel disempowered. Why shouldn't I vote for him? I can't do anything to change it anyway. What is truly amazing, of course, is what we can do once we access and utilize our king energy. The spiritual systems of the world are designed to bring the worshippers in touch with this empowering energy, whether their leaders know it or not, because the energy has such a virtuous effect on those who access it. Note that virtue has the Latin root vis, meaning strength or power. The king's virtue is empowering. Hence, Jesus of Nazareth, at least in part, makes an excellent paradigm of the king energy in the individuating male psyche. Hence also the enduring appeal of Ignatius Loyola's exercises. They provide their practitioners one kind of initiation into the mysteries of the king. Unfortunately for Western women of recent centuries, the Christ paradigm is not really applicable to feminine individuation. For centuries, we've neglected to affirm the queen as equally adequate image for feminine maturity and generativity. A rediscovery of the queen image would greatly benefit our culture. After all, along with learning to access the generative masculine, one of the cardinal tasks now facing us is finding a way back to honoring the generative feminine, both within the male, the anima, and without, in the world. Christian kingship traditions. Throughout the European Middle Ages, the Christian Church controlled the cultural, social, and ideological aspects of human life. It consequently formulated doctrines of kingship. So far as the Church was concerned, Jesus Christ had been the only incarnation of the king energy. The mortal king was at most a specially chosen servant of God. Still, pre-Christian ideas about the king's magical power to affect the fecundity of nature and the well-being of his subjects continued to play a part in the minds of average people. Until fairly recent times, European kings were believed to have had the power to cure certain illnesses by laying on of hands. By the late Middle Ages, something very much like the ancient sacred kingship was on the rise. After the Renaissance era, Louis XIV of France could openly identify himself with the power of the sun. In Tudor England, an interesting debate began, which resulted in a doctrine of kingship called the king's two bodies. A legal question was raised over whether or not a reigning monarch could rightly claim ownership over properties his predecessors had secured. According to the theory, the legal wrangling led to, the king had two bodies. One consisted of the mortal man, temporarily invested with the monarchy. The other was the kingship itself, an ongoing legal entity transcending the individuals in whom it was vested. Here we see, once again, the struggle to understand the relationship between the ego and the archetype. We can see it in this strange world of dual beings, the origins of the royal we, as well as the custom of speaking to the king in the third person singular. When we address the king as Your Majesty, we pay our respects both to his own person and to the transcendent, majestic kingship he embodies. Most national leaders are still treated with some reverence by the majority of their people. The old courtesies and protocols continue in song and ceremony even in thoroughly democratized societies. Their sacred significance is forgotten, but the pattern lives on. For example, in the United States, the president is often greeted at public appearances by the hymn Hail to the Chief, in which he is compared to the evergreen pine. This pine is another representation of the tree of life, a specific image of the Axis Mundi, which can be traced at least as far back as ancient Assyria. Though the United States avoided a monarchy, largely because of Washington's refusal to take the crown, U.S. presidents have ever since enjoyed appropriating the powers and trapping of kings. Franklin Roosevelt refused to relinquish his throne. Richard Nixon tried to isolate his White House, which is, interestingly, an exact translation of the Egyptian word pharaoh, from the profane world. Like the Tibetan kings, he ostensibly at least let his ministers handle the government. In many parts of the world today, the masses of humanity still invest their leaders with attributes of sacred kingship. Iran is a case in point. Before his overthrow, the Shah practiced ceremonies serving from the time of the ancient Persians. After the Iranian Revolution, the Ayatollah Khomeini stepped into the Shah's shoes. He embodied the spiritual, administrative, and military aspects of the ancient kings. He proclaimed that it was his sacred responsibility to enforce the laws of Allah revealed to Muhammad in the Quran. When he died, his people beat their heads with their fists just as their ancient forebears had done. They cried out, "Our Father, why have you left us?" In Latin America, though this seems to be changing rapidly now, a similar cult of the great man continues. Dictators there rule with ancient prerogatives of benevolence and brute force. They defend the sacred soil, as they call it, and the sacred honor of the military elites from whence they come. Wherever charismatic, inordinately powerful men ruled by the wishes of the people, elements of sacred kingship survive. What is intriguing is the need so many people have to project an archetypal structure within every masculine psyche onto a single, supposedly generative man. Many cultures, besides those few we have examined, have sacred kingship traditions of their own. Among them are the aboriginal cultures of the Americas, Africa, India, and Asia, and the kingdoms of Southeast Asia of Sumatra, Java, Micronesia, and Hawaii. The office of the big man, in other cultures, emphasizes ideals of manhood that draw on the same underlying archetype. This widespread phenomena could be partly the result of cultural diffusion, the term for the transmission of ideas from one culture to another through direct or indirect contact. But this process cannot account for the near universality of the institution among peoples who have almost certainly had no contact with one another. Among the Maya, the institution of the sacred kingship arose gradually, side by side with the emergence of higher civilization from an indigenous cultural matrix. This is typical of other societies. If cultural diffusion were primarily responsible, we would expect a sudden and dramatic inception of kingship after contact with kingship societies. More probably, cultural diffusion works as an elaborating impetus shaping a collective urge. An archetypal push, perhaps as inherited instinctual base, illustrated by the phenomenon of the alpha male, seems to be behind kingship traditions. The more psychologically dangerous of the kingship traditions are those where the ego is identified with the archetype. However, the individual psyche can still benefit from imaginally merging from the archetype. Personal neuroses and complexes can be infused with the archetypal king's healing energy and his fullness of being. Pre-modern healing rituals often depend on such a merger with the life-bearing gods. In practice, some distinction was usually drawn between a mortal king and the god he was believed to be incarnating. However, such a king faced the temptation, as does any modern man with an ill-defined ego, to identify completely with the king energy. A disidentification of the ego from the archetype, as was emphasized in the Hebrew tradition, provides us with a safer approach to the enormous power of the king. Bear in mind that disidentification means separation, but not disavowal. The king energy must not be shunned. The answer to the inherent dangers of power is not to avoid power, though the man who identifies with the king suffers a psychosis, depression, and aimlessness plague the man who represses the inner king. In terms of a psychic geography, there is no world, cosmos, without the king. Wherever he is, he makes the world and the axis mundi. He is our means for traveling into the sacred dimension. Without the king, the warrior within becomes a mercenary, fighting for pay and not for any worthwhile goal. Our magician becomes a sophist without a king to serve, able to argue any idea convincingly and believing in none. The lover without a king becomes a promiscuous philanderer, or at the very least, he will be unempathetic and uncaring in his expressions of love. Some men are uncomfortable with the idea of showing that they care for something. Caring seems to them to be dangerously feminine. The danger they secretly fear is of being overwhelmed by the feminine, because they don't understand that the feminine energy they fear is within their own anima. They believe it to be coming from the woman in their lives. This is why the mother, the wife, or the daughter can seem to be threatening figures. But caring isn't limited to the feminine. Men like Gandhi and the aptly named Martin Luther King, Jr. cared for their worlds. Theirs was an aggressive, masculine, potent caring powerful enough to remake the world. They are the examples of what a man can do when he responsibly stewards the numinous power of the king within. Chapter 4. The King in his Fullness. Like the available channels the computer chip provides the electrical current that passes along it, the psyche holds certain hardwired lines of force along which king energy can travel. They examine attributes and functions of the historical sacred kings, as well as those of the mythological king gods, in addition to warrior, magician, and lover energies, reveal a fourfold pattern of king energy. This fourfold pattern has manifested in history precisely because of the four channels available to the king energy in the psyche. Two of these lines of force center and concentrate the archetypal energy, building up a dynamo of numinous power, which the king releases both within the psyche and in the outer world. The very concentration of this energy effects transformation by its uniting of opposites at the center and by its containment in the transforming vessel. We link these two characteristics of the archetypal king by seeing them as closely related aspects of one major form of king energy, introverted energy. Much like the hermetically sealed alchemist's crucible, which when heated transforms base materials into fabulous riches, the king as center, as transforming vessel, changes the unintegrated psychological contents into the gold of personal and potentially global creative transformation. The other two lines of force within the magnetic field of the king is in its fullness expresses extroverted energy. Here we see the archetype manifesting as a procreator and as ordering, producing structure. While these four lines of force work together, it will be useful for us to distinguish these characteristics. But let us remember that they empower us, finally, as a whole system at the center of our psyches. The king as the center, reconciler of the opposites. In myth and legend, it is the king who constellates the center of the world. He is the point in the world where sacred and profane energies meet in a dramatic exchange of libido. The king is therefore the source of useful divine energy in the world. He is the creator king god, or the ancestral god king, who founds and promulgates civilization. His center is his phallic force, the axis mundi, which is variously represented as the tree of life, or world tree, the primordial hill, sacred mountain, or pyramid, the city, temple, palace, or the throne he himself occupies. For his center he can organize the chaos of the earth plane. The divine order in the several forms we've examined, Ma'at, Dharma, Tao, and Torah, radiates from his center and helps affect his organizational impulses. The mortal king's successful incorporation of sacred energy in the profane world is psychologically a model for ego's attempt to make unconscious material conscious, thereby reconciling the opposites in the psyche. Where the ego is successful, a tremendous potential energy is made actual and useful. Thus the ego king axis unites the opposites, spiritual and physical, potential and actual, imagination and deed, and if properly established, can generate full selfhood. As a person becomes more integrated, so does his world, both because his perceptions of the world are increasingly accurate and because the world reveals to him more of its essential nature through actually changed circumstances. Uniting opposites involves making the infinite finite consistently and coherently. We all know how enormously difficult it is to realize our dreams in the world we share. Whether the dream is an invention, an occupational goal, or a way of life, actualizing it can seem almost impossible. The problem is in part one of translation, of bringing personal, proverbial intuitions into words or forms that both we and others can grasp. This is the very problem sacred kings faced in trying to translate divine imperatives into human law. Communication along an axis between the opposites of mortal king and king god typifies an ego-archetypal axis of great importance to Jungian psychology. Although to Jungians, the self at the center of every psyche is a fully androgynous psychological essence shared by both men and women, it is doubtful that such a self can be constituted in the real world. More likely, any self actually manifested by a human being will be predominantly either masculine or feminine. If this is true, the ultimate axis a man can realize and still be a man is an axis between his ego and a masculine self. This masculine self can be known primarily through the ego's appropriate accessing of the archetypal king. Since the fully manifested king experiences a passionate union with the anima, a man's inner feminine sub-personality, as queen, a man can experience the deep self approaching the Jungian expellum, but his self is likely to be asymmetrical masculine. All pairs of psychologically dynamic opposites are reconciled in the tranquil but dynamic self at the psyche's center. The king is the agent by which opposites are experienced. For example, life and death are united in the person of the sacred king. The resurrection of the dead king is one expression of this unity. The ritual slaying of one king and the installation of the next is another. Behind such rituals is the wisdom that life must die before life can flourish. This is the thinking that sends John Barleycorn, the temporary king of grain, out into the fields to die after the harvest. There is a psychological truth to this thinking, that we must die to our old selves in order to become anew. In this dance of life and death, life is the victor. St. Paul's Christ finally swallows death, ingesting it and using it for purposes of a greater kingship, that of Christ Pantocrator, ruler of the cosmos. Other king gods incorporated good and evil, just as Christ held life and death at once within his body. Yahweh in the biblical text is the source of both good and evil, creation and destruction. The Hindu deities transcend good and evil by uniting the two in their own mysterious essences. We can read the Chinese symbol of the Tao as a visual image of these reconciled dialectics: light and darkness, aggression and passivity, masculinity and femininity, good and evil. Each polar opposite is intertwined with the other. At the exact point where one pole swells to its fullest expression, there the seed of the other appears. The opposites are in dynamic union, each giving rise to the other, each interpretable only in the terms of the other. The same symbol could usefully represent the ego and its shadow. Such much of this personal shadow carries values and insights that could contribute substantially to the ego's experience of life. Elements of the personal shadow certainly need to be integrated. When they can be, they make for a greater psychic depth. However, certain transpersonal aspects of the shadow, what could be called the collective shadow, cannot be integrated fully by any human ego. Collective aspects of the shadow express forces of radical destructiveness and death. Here is the point where the possibility of genuine, unmitigated evil arises. Mystics from the most spiritual traditions maintain that we cannot live intense, authentic lives without a consciousness of our own personal deaths. So, perhaps neither death nor forces of destruction should simplistically be viewed as evil. Only when life is experienced under the aspect of eternity can it be lived with genuine appreciation. An Egyptian enthronement myth demonstrates the dependence of life and death, good and evil, upon each other. Two cosmic antagonists, Horus and Set, were the sponsor gods of Lower and Upper Egypt, respectively. It was the pharaoh who first harnessed the energy of their dialectic by uniting the two Egypts and wearing the double crown of Horus and Set. Though the two gods were eternally antagonistic, their friction helped generate Ma'at in both the sacred and profane dimensions. The pharaoh was announced at his coronation as the two lords, because he had embodied and transcended the antagonism between Horus and Set. He offered his people an image of an essential conflict of the world and an example for its resolution. A king's marriage was a mythic union as his coronation. In some societies, his marriage was literally the land of his kingdom as personified by the queen. In others, the queen was seen as the representative of Mother Cosmos in her entirety. Underlying the various myths was the idea of the union of the opposites of masculine and feminine principles. Without such union, subjects could hardly expect the gods and goddesses to yield up their bounties to the earth. Most ancient mythologies harbored a very sexy set of gods and goddesses, often descended from an initial transsexual or bisexual creator. These second or third generation deities constituted sky, earth, air, water, fire, and so on, and it was they who were responsible for the daily maintenance of the world. In ancient Egyptian paintings, for example, Geb, god of the earth, was shown lying on his back, erect phallus pointing skyward toward Nut, the goddess of the heavens, who was arched langorously above him. Their happily ever after erotic interplay ensured the fructifying unity of earth and sky. The king and queen mirrored deities such as these and encouraged their eroticism by performing sympathetic sexual rituals on the earthly plane. In most societies, a king without a queen was held to be sterile and his kingdom paid the price. The royal marriage expresses the masculine need for the feminine, and vice versa, in order to achieve fullness of being. In a good relationship with a woman, in a union that throws a man's masculine characteristics into sharp contrast with the feminine, a man can engender an intimate, enhancing self-relationship with his own anima. In so doing, he sets up an ever more stable center between his masculine and feminine poles. In our culture, the anima often gets split off and repressed. Feminine characteristics in a man are deemed highly suspect, but if a man consciously seeks to develop a relationship with his anima at the same time that he seeks a deeper accessing of his masculine characteristics, he will find his masculinity affirmed and supported. By acknowledging his feminine side, a man raises his consciousness about complementary masculine structures and can be inspired to achieve fullness of being as a man. As the sense of deeply grounded masculinity becomes more secure, he is free to claim his feminine qualities without fear of being overwhelmed by them. His capacity for creative expression will multiply exponentially. His relationships with women in the outer world will likewise take a positive turn. Such a man, his masculinity reinforced by his inner feminine, can meet life with a centered sense of wholeness and compassion not often seen in our culture. The king as transforming vessel. St. Paul's Christ emptied himself of divine energy in order to take on human form and impart his libido to the world. Once filled with the sacred essence, any man can become an equally sacred vessel. Other kings were more conservative of their divine energy and careful not to let it be improperly dissipated. A king who was believed to be the center was also naturally regarded as the locus of tremendous energy. He too was a sacred vessel, a container of divine energy. Often his energy seemed so volatile the king had himself to be contained. By insulation and containment, subjects were shielded from the king's dangerous, unmitigated power. Also, when a king's energy was conserved within a single spot, it grew ever more concentrated and powerful. Through initiated priests and officers, by the appropriate rites and ceremonies, this concentrated power could be drawn off in its usable form for the good of the people. This careful handling of the energy is reminiscent of nuclear power plant practices today. Reactor cores are carefully sealed off from the people who ultimately benefit from the energy produced. Direct exposure to this energy is fatal. The core is a reactive supply of concentrated nuclear material. Elaborate technology transforms this contained nuclear power into usable electricity. Any accidental exposure of nuclear material to the profane atmosphere results in widespread destruction of plant, animal, and human life. Exactly what the ancients imagined the consequences of inappropriately released king energy would be. Often subjects were not even permitted to look at their kings. In Iran, anyone who beheld the king's fiery crown would be blinded or driven mad by the sight. Yahweh had to turn his back to Moses on Mount Sinai so that Moses would not be destroyed. Semele, a Greek woman, was not so lucky. A glimpse of Zeus reduced her to ashes. Prince Arjuna was spared of a similar fate before Krishna by the use of a special protective preparation Krishna had supplied him. Even so, after seeing the majesty of his god, Arjuna had to beg Krishna to return to an anthropomorphic form, lest he lose his mind. Initiation served in other societies the same purpose as Arjuna's special preparation. Hebrew priests alone, through their schooling in the mysteries of the Torah, could manage touching the Ark of the Covenant as it was carried to Jerusalem. When once an ordinary foot soldier reached up to steady the precariously balanced ark, he was instantly struck dead for his pains. Some traditions avoided these dangers by removing their kings from the everyday world. Taboos and rituals were employed to enable the king to conserve and concentrate his divine power, the energy of the archetypal king. The daily lives of many sacred kings were oppressively regulated, so much so that we know of instances in which the man selected to become the next vessel for the archetype's incarnation skipped town to avoid his coronation. In Tibet, for example, the king was kept away from the outside world to avoid the diluting effects of lesser modes of reality. All his nominal administrative, military, even priestly functions were delegated to officers, who served for him in a way as a step-down transformers of his archetypal king energy. In parts of Africa, the king was required to stay behind a veil or drawn curtain so that his divine communications would not for a moment be interrupted. From India to central Mexico, taboos existed forbidding the king to touch his foot to the earth. The fear was that he would ground out and deplete the sacred charge. This is the origin of the red carpet. It is a simple means of keeping royal feet off the ground. The incestuous marriages sanctioned by many royal lineages were a further method of keeping the vital essence concentrated and contained in the family. Another method of containing and concentrating the sacred energy was the construction of isolating rooms in the king's palaces and temples. His inner sanctuary would often be protected by armed guards. Only the initiated or ritually purified could pass beyond them. To the audience hall, and within this room, the throne would be still more isolated, by being raised on a dais perhaps, or surrounded by a retaining wall. The psychological truth supporting this degree of protection is that the archetypes are immensely powerful dynamic structures, deserving of careful handling. They must be accessed in a way that is life-enhancing rather than death-dealing. In their raw and uncontained forms, the archetypes can easily overwhelm other psychological structures. This is clearly the case in individual psychopathology. It is also true in the arena of world history, the sphere of the collective psyche. How many nations have been overwhelmed by the mass hysteria unleashed by the archetypal warrior, for example, when ego structures were not sufficiently strong? The ego ultimately is the only psychological structure capable of transforming the energy of an archetype. A consolidated ego, whose strength is augmented by a deepening and a broadening of its sphere of consciousness, is able both to develop individual ego archetype axis and to balance one against the other. Ego structure is the psychological equivalent of shielding and transformer systems noted in ancient ritual and in modern technology. A properly functioning ego king axis gives us a man the ability to keep a cognitive and emotional distance from the archetype, and to access and transform its energy in generative ways. The ego's capacity to conceptualize the king as circumscribed entity keeps the archetype's energy within bounds. This concentrates the energy of the archetype within archetypal structure and protects the rest of the psyche from being flooded by its expansive libido. The king as procreator. Procreative energy constitutes the king's third line of force. Procreation is libido in the process of incarnating itself. It is the process of a dynamic taking concrete form. Against enormous destructive potential massed against it, it is the force that is always saying yes to life, yes to the new, yes to the creativity. It is the phallic thrust of creation, the divine urge to penetrate the profane and seed it with sacred. It is the erotic urge that drives gods and goddesses to couple in order to generate earth, sky, sea, air, and all the forms of life therein. It is the force beyond Yahweh's joyful command to his creatures to be fruitful and multiply. Hindu iconography celebrates the procreative power of the king gods in their lover mode. From the passionate embraces of the gods and goddesses, the creative world flows. Sculptures on the temple at Konarak depict hundreds of gods and goddesses in every conceivable sexual position, caressing, licking, sucking, kissing, penetrating, and being penetrated. They are one great throbbing mass of libido in stone. The message is that procreation is essential activity and perhaps the greatest joy of the spiritual dimension. Both the king gods and the sacred kings in the Near East were associated with such procreative images as the tree of life and the waters of life. The tree of life here represents the axis mundi and the phallic generativity of the archetypal king. The waters of life were his semen. Jesus said in his procreator mode that he was the vine and we are the branches. We are fruit, therefore, of the cosmic phallus. Through the procreator, the infinite is made finite, the possible made actual. The gleam in the Father's eye takes flesh and the world moves forward. At the most literal level, of course, procreation is a sexual event that results in offspring. It is an activity of generativity that produces the next generation. The sacred king and queen were called upon to actualize the God's procreator intentions. The air of their union was concrete proof that the kingdom was flourishing. Guaranteeing an orderly dynastic succession, the crown prince assured uninterrupted economic, social, and political stability. He also assured that through him the life-giving energy of the archetypal king would be present for some time into the future. But beyond the necessity of producing an heir, the king embodied the archetype as procreator in a spiritual sense as well. In some ancient belief systems, the king gods actually imbued their subjects with souls. The pharaoh imparted some of the eternal Ankh, or life force, to every Egyptian, drawing from his own limitless reserves of Ka. He did this by beholding, blessing, and embracing his people. The sacred kings held their public audiences when taboos did not prohibit them, as much to see their subjects as to be seen by them. Both sides drew power and identity from these meetings. As the psychoanalytic self-psychologists have pointed out, we become real to ourselves only insofar as our early caregivers are able to mirror us. When a parent looks at a child, the child receives the look as a constitutive glance. The child feels real by virtue of being seen. Think of the 4-year-old's repeated demands to have his every act witnessed. To the extent our parents can reflect back to us our real feelings and affirm to us importance by physically touching us and really seeing us, we are able to consolidate our identities. Having a sense of validated identity is essential to acquiring a sense of soul. A parent who has successfully imparted a soul to his child has experienced the ultimate act of parenting. This is the essence, what has historically been called blessing. This process is one Gary Small and John Trent have examined in their book, The Blessing. In their comparative study of the phenomenon in ancient Hebrew culture and in modern times, Smalley and Trent outlined the 5 aspects of blessing: meaningful touch, spoken blessing, attachment of high value to the other, picturing for the other a special future, and active commitment to the other to help realize that future. A wonderful Egyptian painting from the Tel al-Amarna illustrates elements of blessing in the context of sacred kingship. We see the pharaoh Akhenaten depicted standing in the upper window of a palace. In the courtyard below is his esteemed minister Aid, his arms outstretched to the king. Akhenaten is throwing the gold bracelets down to Ai, who catches and slips them one by one over his wrists. Akhenaten, the king god, is blessing and valuing his minister. By showering such wealth upon him, Akhenaten gives Ai the means to picture a special future for himself, as well as to realize that future. The meaningful touch is offered by the sun disk hovering above Akhenaten's head, extending its rays like open hands. Akhenaten was the incarnation of Horus, as was every pharaoh. The familiar hieroglyph of the Eye of Horus is ubiquitous in Egyptian relics. The Eye of Horus created what it beheld, and so had a tremendous importance in Egyptian culture. Eye is being seen and created by his god. People crowded to public audiences in ancient Egypt because of the importance they attached to being seen by their pharaoh. It was for the people the most direct means available for being regenerated with a fresh infusion of Ka. A similar thing happens today when the British royals travel to America, for example, or the Pope appears on his balcony at St. Peter's in Rome. Think of some of the phrases we commonly use today. What does it mean to hold someone in high regard? Or think what we mean when we say, that boy is the apple of his father's eye. Or the British epithet, damn your eyes. Why? Because whoever says that is being shamed by being witnessed. There is an undeniable power in the looks we receive in our lives. When a mentor looks at you, his gaze is an act. He may be supplying for you something you wish your parents had supplied. His look helps to create you. Analysans will often report, in the midst of the course of the therapy, that they feel terrific for 2 or 3 days after being seen by their therapist. Their depression lifts, and they feel vital and capable. Then they fall back into their old patterns for the rest of the week until the next appointment comes around. Partly, the temporary transformation is due to the transference typical of this stage, but partly their vitality comes simply from being witnessed. Dr. Bernie Siegel is doing work with his cancer patients based on the creative power of seeing. He has his patients go home, find private time and place, and look at themselves standing naked before a mirror. He tells them to keep looking until they find something about their bodies they can really love. It doesn't have to be much to begin with. The shape of the nose, perhaps the arch of the foot. He asks them to extend this beloved part of the body, taking as much time as necessary until they can truly say they love their entire body. This exercise is not useful only to cancer patients. Most of us use a mirror only to check to see that our masks isn't slipping and that our hair is still in place. Try one day looking into your eyes in the mirror. Probably it will feel a little strange and unfamiliar. Try giving yourself the kind of deep, compassionate look you'd give a loved one. You can see for yourself what kind of creative power resides in your eyes. There is a further sense in which the king is the procreator, a sense that seems odd indeed to us. Paradoxically, a king's sacrificial death, as well as his life of self-sacrifice, is procreative. His blood nourishes the earth as fertilizing semen. His sacrifices exist to provision the world. The psychological truth in this is that there can be no creation without self-sacrifice. The act of voluntarily dying to one's wider potential in order to realize an actual and therefore limited goal is what results in world building. We all know this. The choices we have to make in life are really acts of self-sacrifice. We must choose this option and not another. We sacrifice the potential for the sake of the actual. Take, for example, the artist before a blank canvas. Until he dips his brush into the paint, the canvas offers him a pure white potential. Almost anything can happen. As soon as he begins to paint, he has begun to sacrifice his options. The nearly infinite possibilities for subject matter, color, texture, and technique become finite. Limitless libido is taking on finite form. As he makes his choices, partly consciously, partly not, he experiences a sense of loss, because he does lose some of the vast, ecstatic, intuitive imagery that inspired him. He selects against expressing everything. He sacrifices the whole of his creative self for the purpose of realizing a fragment. Also, he allows the charge of creative life force that is built up within him, demanding expression and release, to drain out of him. Here he is like the sacred king who touches his foot to the earth and loses his concentrated life force to the material world. And yet, not only has the artist provisioned the world and pushed forward the whole of creation, he has always been provided for. He is transfigured by a fresh upwelling of ecstatic life force through the incomparable experience of empowerment that any successful creative achievement brings. Again, like St. Paul's Christ, or the East Asian gods and the myths of descent, he has emptied himself in order to recreate the world, and also like them, he has himself been filled and recreated. He has become, in a sense, his own procreator and been born again. The king gods of the ancient myths created the world, and through their incarnation or servant, the sacred king, the gods continue to care for and to nurture not only human beings, but all life and the ecosystem as a whole. The archetypal king and his procreator mode is concerned about all living things and about a harmonious balance among them. This is the ecological sense of the Ma'at, Dharma, Tao, or Torah, the cosmic order the king gods and the sacred kings manifested. The sacred kings who embodied the archetype were always seen as the stewards of the natural order as well as the social. These kings were sometimes even referred to as the divine gardener. The king as structure. The archetype of the king provides the energy of the fourth line of force as a means to build things and put things in order. The sacred king who draws from this energy functions as a structurer. He brings divine order to society through law and custom. He translates the tongue of the gods into pictographs and runes, and thereby initiates written language. Communicating with the minds of the gods, he brings his people metaphysics and theology. He expresses godly beauty by inventing the arts. Intuiting the hidden essences of things, he discovers science, architecture, engineering, technology, and architectural skills. He organizes the skilled trades, the merchants, and the craftsmen. He institutes hierarchical levels in a society, encouraging the division of labor and specialization in industry. As the Aztecs said of Quetzalcoatl, quote, "Truly it began with him, truly from him it flowed, all art and knowledge." Close quote. Succeeding kings take on the responsibility of sustaining the divinely instituted world order. Like Hammurabi, most ancient kings were codifiers of laws. Each culture had a Moses. In order to implement their new laws, kings had to be able administrators, repeating in miniature the king god's administration of the universe. King and court paralleled the heavenly court in which the gods and goddesses were the divine counterparts of the earthly councils of ministers. The sacred king was enjoined by the gods to ensure peace and security for all of his people. This he achieved as the supreme overseer of the legal system and as the final court of appeal. As ancient legal and prescriptive text shows, the early systems of justice were often heavily weighted in favor of the weak and the poor. Theoretically, the kings protected the weak against the strong. They were the special providers for widows and orphans. In addition to protecting their own people, the sacred kings were required to extend, where possible, the created order the kingdom represented. They were also champions in the mythic sphere in the gods' cosmic war against chaos and death. The king's military campaigns were massive acts of sympathetic magic designed to aid the gods. so that when he most needed it, the gods would return the favor. Oracles and prophets lamented conditions on earth when a lapse occurred in the continuity of a sacred kingship. In the absence of a strong king in a structure or mode, human morale and ethical values, social cohesiveness, even the orderliness of the natural world were experienced as breaking down. Neferu, an Egyptian scribe of the 15th century BCE, left us this record of just such a catastrophe. Give heed, my heart, and weep for this land whence thou art sprung. Ruined is this land, while none is concerned for it, none speaks, none sheds tears. The sun is veiled, and he shines not that the people may see. The river of Egypt is dry, one may cross it on foot. All good things have passed away. The land is prostrate in wretchedness by reason of that food of the Bedouin who invade the land. Enemies have arisen in Egypt. The Asiatics have descended into Egypt. What never had happened has happened. A man sits in his corner turning his back while one slays another. I will show thee a son as an enemy, a brother as a foe, and a man slaying his own father. Every mouth is filled with love me, and all good things have passed away. After this lamentation, Neferu wishes for a sacred king to come who will restore order and drive the foreigners from the kingdom. Neferu proclaims a coming king whose characteristics and actions are not unlike those predicted 1,000 years later for the Hebrew Messiah. He writes, "There shall be a king of the south to come, whose name is Ameni. He is the son of a woman of Nubia. He shall take the white crown. He shall put on the red crown, uniting the double diadem. He shall pacify the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, with what they desire. The people of his time shall rejoice. The Son of Man shall make his name forever and ever. Those who plotted evil and devised rebellion, they have stilled their mouths for fear of him. The Asiatics shall fall by his sword, and the Libyans shall fall by his flame. Righteousness, Ma'at, shall return to its place. Unrighteousness shall be cast out. Let him rejoice who shall see it, and who shall be serving the king." Ultimately, the enemies of the archetypal king are on the mythic or spiritual levels of reality. Chaos is not the mere expression of randomness. Death is not simply the natural process of molecular descent from higher to lower levels of organization. Chaos and death are demons that directly threaten the divinely decreed world order. On high, holy days, sacred kings often assumed the roles of the structure gods in dramatizations of the myths. By performing in these dramas, they made immediate the life and death struggles between the king as structure and the demons of chaos and death. Because the structure wins these struggles in the end, the sacred kings enacted and realized these happy endings for their own kingdoms. This is not necessarily as archaic a practice as it may sound. In Shakespeare's England, the Jacobean courtly masques provided the same function. Though prevented by decorum from speaking lines, the monarch and the members of his royal family often appeared in these mini-dramas, richly costumed as gods and goddesses. The appearance of royalty would signal an end to the chaotic first scene of the masque, and banish the hags, satyrs, or witches who featured in this beginning. The royals restored proper order to the piece, and by implication to the kingdom. After a chorus in praise of the king, the court spent the rest of the night dancing. Here is part of a speech from a masque by Ben Jonson in praise of King James. "He is a god o'er kings, yet stoops he then Nearest a man when he doth govern men, to teach them by the sweetness of the sway, and not by force. He makes it ever day and ever spring, where he doth shine and quickens everything, like a new nature. so that, true to call him by his title, is to say, he's all. King James's own son appeared in this particular masqué. Presented on January 1st, 1611, the masqué concentrated the court's attention on the king's power to regenerate the year. He makes it ever spring, despite the winter, a reign over chaos. The terrific expense of these masqués, sets to this one, were designed by none other than Ingio Jones, further underlined the king's unlimited wealth in pussians. Alright. The entertainment assured the court that all would be well for at least another year. The structure and function of the archetype also helped the sacred kings order their own inner lives. As we have seen, this attention to inner harmony, whether it be channeled through Ma'at, Dharma, Tao, or Torah, brought to the outer world any success the king had in his inner struggle, since whatever occurred at his center was transmitted to the outermost reaches of the kingdom. His own enlightenment amounted to kingdom-wide shifts in nature and society. In a sense, the philosophers who posited ideas such as these believed themselves to live in a holographic universe. The whole was completely present in the king, and the image the king projected was the image of the whole. In order to attain this level of personal development, the sacred kings, particularly of the Far East, became men of great learning. Even by doing only this, they furthered the creation of the world, ultimately dependent upon Brahman or Buddha consciousness for its definition and for its very being. The structure and function of the king archetype signals his centered role in the creation of consciousness. Consciousness, at least for the ego, is a structured thing. A cohesive sense of personal identity is achieved optimally by a progressive expansion of ego-awareness, both of the total individual psychic system that a person is and of the outside world. Usually, human beings are conscious of only a limited number of either psychological contents or of outer world phenomena. The purpose of conventional education is to widen the scope of consciousness to include more and more data about the world around us. The pursuit of self-reflective disciplines, such as psychology or the spiritual traditions, deepens ego-awareness of the structures and dynamics of the psyche. The minimal degree of ego consciousness that satisfies most people demands the splitting off and repressing of enormous amounts of psychological material. People have been taught to disapprove of much of this material, but life circumstances, inner neuroses, relationships that offer great joy or pain all conspire to expand awareness. When the ego confronts and accesses previously unwanted, uncomfortable psychic material, the ego builds for itself a more cohesive, structured, and open-ended ego consciousness. Ego consciousness seems to depend upon the capacity to differentiate one thing from another and to make value distinctions between them. The idea is related to the masculine principle of discernment. Though not an exclusively male preserved, the mythic image of discrimination is of the sword that cuts through confusion. When confronted with the impossibly tangled Gordian knot, one no man had yet been able to untie, Alexander, discerning the intellectual dishonesty of the knot's design, took his sword and simply cut the knot in two. Solomon was able to decide to which of the two mothers he should award a disputed baby by offering to take a sword and cut the baby in two. The baby's true mother, of course, forsook her rights to the child, preferring it should live at all costs. By this, Solomon recognized her as the true mother and restored the child to her. The ancients called this masculine principle the sword of gnosis, by distinguishing between light and darkness, good and evil, and other polar opposites. Discrimination provides us with gnosis, or insightful knowledge. In many of the Near Eastern myths of creation, the Creator God can make the ordered world by only distinguishing between finite entities. Ptah, for example, made the Egyptian world by speaking the names of things. He drew up names from the creative abyss of his own mind, where all things were undifferentiated, only because he had achieved a level of consciousness in which he could imagine definite things. Christian thinkers developed a similar theology of the logos or the word. This builds on the Genesis story, wherein things are spoken of and thereby created. In the Babylonian creation epic, Marduk literally wields the sword of Gnosis when he slays Tiamat, the dragon of chaos. With one half of her divided body he makes the oceans, the other he uses for the sky. He carves up her consort Kingu as well into the earth and all the earth's creatures. Other structures rising from formlessness emulate the emergent nature of consciousness. Egyptian mythology tells us of the primordial hill rising from the ocean, just as the ego structure arises out of an undifferentiated consciousness. The hill expanded quickly, lifting up more and more land up from out of the cosmic depths. Similar, the growth of ego structure depends on the process of making more and more unconscious material conscious, and raising implicit structures of personality into the explicit light of awareness. The sacred king imitates this by building his pyramid, ziggurat, or dais. And from his raised vantage point, he calls his people into greater consciousness and on into the adventures of civilization. Mount Sinai, Mount Zion, Mount Meru, Mount Harabarazati were all sites of revelation. These summits represented the process of ascent involved in raising a civilization. Where a sacred mountain was unavailable, pyramids or ziggurats were erected as their artificial echoes. Atop the stepped pyramids, the Maya's god king communed with his ancestors. In the small blue tiled temples of the ziggurat's summit, Shamash dictated his laws to the Mesopotamian kings. Moses ascended Mount Sinai for the Hebrews when he received the tablets of the law straight from Yahweh's fiery intellect. Christian mythology states that Jesus was transfigured on the top of a high hill, and he delivers his definitive sermon on a mount. The pyramids and ziggurats were conceived as staircases. Their levels stood at once for the different planes of reality and for the steps to enlightenment. Even the smooth-sided Egyptian pyramids were referred to in contemporary texts as stairways, meant to aid the pharaoh's ascension to the heavens. The sloping sides represented the sun's slanting rays, and the golden capstone also was an image of the sun, helping to draw the pharaoh's soul up into the mind of God. Why is consciousness depicted as ascending? Why were these enormous structures raised to illustrate and facilitate consciousness raising? Because this is true to our experience of ego consciousness in relation to the unconscious, we know that it takes tremendous effort to become conscious. To do this, we must build psychological structures. Our sense is that the unconscious, while not inferior to the ego, is still somehow underneath it. The ultimate literal source of light, the sun, is always above us. Since consciousness has universally been associated with light, perhaps because our primary discerning organ is the eye, we must look up in order to be conscious. Almost universally, the sun has been deified. This is sensible, as all life depends upon the sun. Ancient peoples believed in an unimaginably self-ordered and enlightened consciousness had created the whole world, and for an image of this they looked first to the sun. The sun gods rose to prominence over the widespread chthonic underworld gods, and the remnants of the earth goddesses religions of earlier times, during the era when the great urban civilizations first appeared. These sun gods triumphed over an essentially feminine unconsciousness. This fit well with the insights psychology offers in understanding the development of the masculine self. Chaotic feminine unconsciousness predates the emergence of masculine ego structures. In fact, Recent brain structure research suggests that genetically male fetus begins with an essentially female brain. Only after the male genitals form and testosterone is released in the fetus does the brain structure itself in a typically masculine configuration. The underlying primal feminine matrix, which does, in fact, express more diffuse consciousness, is superseded by the burgeoning masculine capacity for focused consciousness, for a more structured and specialized way of postnatal perceiving, feeling, thinking, and behaving. As we've seen, Marduk defeats a chaotic feminine sea dragon. The association of the watery abyss with the feminine reflects the briny, amniotic fluid of the womb where we all have our beginning. Ocean and mother are intuitively linked. In the early stages of development, even after we are born, we are for a time quite largely psychologically one with our mothers. It is with the utmost difficulty that we learn we separate from her. Most of us never do learn this completely. The struggle to achieve a separate identity is most urgent for a boy, since his gender identity depends on the separation. The child in every man longs to return to the womb, a place where his every need was attended to. Utter passivity was possible in exchange for an absence of self. Anyone fearing a loss of self might come to view the realm of the feminine with hostility. But masculine consciousness is one only to the degree that the boy and the man can break definitely with the seductive power of his mother. We must be wary that her power doesn't draw him back into a regressive merger with her, back into a time before he existed. The burning light of the sun draws his masculine ego up like oxygen from the darkness of that first watery unconscious nirvana. The circuit diagram necessary for ascending into masculine consciousness is the archetypal king. He is the center of dynamic energy, transformed and made useful by its procreator and structure aspects. His interests lie in his generativity, consciousness raising, and the world building. He is particularly discerning and independent. Such is the fully manifested archetypal king, the king in his fullness, as expressed in myth and history. He consolidates the functions of the other mature masculine archetypes. The warrior aids him in setting, defending, and extending boundaries. The magician helps order his thought and provides ideas on how to materialize them. Both the magician and the warrior help develop the psychospiritual machinery a man needs before the king can incarnate within him, and the lover ensures that incarnation will be life-enhancing and joyful. Chapter 5. Generative Man, the challenge of kingship for contemporary man. The qualities most cultures identify as masculine in most historical epochs are remarkably consistent. David Gilmour cites in his Manhood in the Making cultures that include the nose of North America and the Mediterranean world, past and present, societies of South and East Asia, of Truk Islands and the South Pacific, the Meninaku Islands of South America, the Samburu of Africa, the Sambia of New Guinea, and many others. He finds in nearly all of them common understandings of what constitutes manhood. The big man of New Guinea, the Muambres of Spain, and the worthy men of the Samburu are all protectors, providers, and procreators. They manifest a selfless capacity for hard work, risk-taking, courage, and endurance. Mature men embrace these roles in order to nurture their families and build their communities. They are community bulwarks against natural and human foes. Where able to accumulate wealth, they share it liberally. They are expected to be energetically sexual and to foster the new generation. While there are local emphasis on one or another of the different functions of his transcultural understanding of manhood, protector, provider, or procreator, Gilmore notes that the pattern is consistent. The evidence from this new anthropology, as well as from other fields of study, makes plausible, even compelling, the idea that these traits of manhood are transcultural expression of the archetypes of mature masculinity and, ultimately, of the incarnated king. Each of the four foundational archetypes powers the tripartite engine of Gilmore's manhood. He largely stresses characteristics we assign to the king, the warrior, and the lover. He misses the magician. Though he recognizes man as hunter, worker, provider, and creator, for the most part he neglects man as thinker and ritual elder. We speculate that because Gilmore himself is a thinker and unconsciously a ritual elder, pointing out the enlightened way to other men, his oversight is in missing his own dominant characteristics. We are all more or less subject to blind spots, which, in fact, hold the keys to our personality styles, interests, and motivations. From Gilmore, we can take a transcultural perspective concerning the ideal, mature masculine self, one we'll be calling Generative Man. A generative man may be communist or capitalist, industrialist or peasant. He may be an animal rights advocate or a whale hunter, and is as much a poet as a soldier. While a man's lifestyle and work, under the best circumstances, will reflect his generativity, generative man is the foundational aspect of every man in every culture, and the closest parallel modern psychoanalysis has offered to the archetypal king. Generative man is a term that psychoanalyst Erik Erikson coined. In our view, Gilmore's manhood and Erikson's generative man are two similar ways of viewing the king. The man appropriately accessing the king is the protector, provider, and procreator for his people and his world, whoever and wherever they may be. Generativity is the true basis for mature human being. Besides procreation in the biological sense, generativity includes all the products of the human imagination, cultural, religious, technological, and ecological. For Erikson, as for Jung, there is no inherent conflict between the instinctual drives in human beings and their psychological and spiritual aspirations. The so-called higher functions of human being arise out of our animal roots. Erikson calls the archetypes, quote, action patterns, close quote, and when they are not distorted by psychopathology of one kind or another, their push is always toward generativity. According to Don Browning's analysis of Erikson, generative man's virtues are love, care, and wisdom. As Browning says, quote, the basic trust and hope of the generative man gives him the trust not only to continue his own existence, but to share in the generation of succeeding generations and to help care for and sustain their lives with hope. Close quote. All the kings taken by a mature man, all the wealth he accumulates, are finally designed to care for and sustain his family and community. Ultimately, this caring and sustenance are intended for his children, the world's inheritors. Trust and hope are products of strength and maturity. Out of strength and maturity, generative man can draw upon inner resources of autonomy and will. Out of his autonomy and will, he desires and has the capacity for intimate relationships. In personal relationships, as far as the social hierarchy will allow, he beholds the true worth of others. He provides what Erikson calls a confirming face. In other words, he mirrors and blesses. This is certainly the case in the male-bonded, egalitarian brotherhoods Gilmore examines. For Erikson, generative man's relationships are not only intimate, but societal as well. He has the capacity and desire to make meaningful contributions to the community. All these qualities bring a generative man a viable identity. This identity incorporates flexibility with integrity as well as with a consolidated style of fidelity. Out of his consolidated self, a generative man is able to make commitments to his family, to his society, and ultimately to his God. His vision is of a transpersonal other, whose coherence derives in part from his own integrity. The initiated men of any society have placed their personal concerns beneath those of the larger social groups, and the social groups are subordinate to a divine reality. To Gilmore's way of thinking, manhood can be either tribalistic or universal in its general outlook and in its visioning of its own tasks and duties. Real men, for him, can function with a variety of definitions of the greater good, from the most parochial to the most expansive. However, Erikson goes a step beyond Gilmore here. Erikson claims that generative man must be a universalist. He must nurture his own progeny, culture, and religion, as well as the larger world of all human societies, and the environment as an ecological whole. Generative man, for Erikson, balances the good of society with the good of the planet by honoring both technology and nature. As Browning says, quote, to generate and maintain a world, but in such a way as to include and yet transcend one's own issue, one's own family, tribe, nation, and race. This is the essence of the generative man. Close quote. A man who has accessed the king properly demonstrates Gilmore's manhood and Erikson's generative man. The king calls every man into an ego-archetypal axial relationship. Men who can achieve such a relationship are modern-day embodiments of sacred kingship. When the ego is in the proper alignment with the king, it achieves the humility of the creature before its transpersonal source, its God. At the same time, the ego comes to realize that God is within. Quote, if you knew me, you would know my Father also, close quote, said Jesus. Jesus' statement illustrates an ego in an integral relationship with the inner king. Let us portray an ideal generative man. Through our portrait may have a somewhat cultural specific coloring. The underlying manhood structures remain transcultural. No man can fully embody all of these qualities. However, psychologists often will describe at length what is wrong with us without providing us with an image of what it would like to be healthy and whole. We'd like to address this imbalance here, for without a vision, the people perish. The generative man, a vision for us. A generative man, drawing on the characteristics of the archetypal king, accesses the center, transformer, procreator, and structurer functions in an integrated way. He is creative himself. He welcomes creativity in others. He provides a safe, containing space where people around him can flourish. He offers encouragement by taking care to really see others. In beholding his fellows, he mirrors and affirms them. He confirms their individuality and the reality of their suffering and their joy. He is conscious of and sensitive to their underlying feelings and motives. He blesses their lives by sanctifying the fruits of their inner and outer labors. Because he is himself secure and centered, the generative man can allow others to be themselves. He does not experience them as extensions of himself, but recognizes when he is confusing his own motives and values, his own hopes or fears, with those of others. He is not easily thrown off balance by others. Even hostile and aggressive people cannot easily get to him. His integrity is such that sarcasm, innuendo, accusation, and confrontation have little effect upon him. He can manage in most situations to defend his legitimate personal boundaries firmly and without hostility. Yet when a wrathful response is called for, he is able to act aggressively. There are situations that present clear and present dangers to us. The generative man, drawing upon his warrior king reserves, responds with vigor in these situations to neutralize his foes. A generative man seeks to free himself of envy. Possessing all the power he needs for his own life, he can dispense to those who need and deserve it the affirming energy of admiration. He confers deserved riches, symbolic and material, upon members of his family, his friends, his business associates, and others. Rather than belittle others, he supports them in their attempts to contribute something of value to society. In a leadership role, the generative man evaluates his subordinates' ideas and performance objectively and with compassion. If others have good ideas, he celebrates them, implements them, and gives credit where credit is due. At home, he lavishes deserved praise upon his children when they come to him for mirroring. But he never exaggerates his praise. He speaks the truth, and the truth he speaks gives every member of his family a firm basis for self-evaluation and self-affirmation. His truthful words and actions help others feel their own reality and get a sense of their own authentic being. He deflates grandiosity and enables others to discover their realistic greatness. A generative man may be a mediator between the archetypal king and his fellow human beings. He may be further along than others in accessing the king and the other mature masculine archetypes without being overwhelmed by them. He is a seasoned veteran of the energy exchange between ego consciousness and the depths of the unconscious. He is familiar with the inner landscape we all share, its dangers and pleasures, its angels and demons, its illusions and truths. With the wisdom of this familiarity, the generative man can help others in their effort to integrate. He can reflect back to others what he hears their inner adversaries and allies saying, because at one time or another he's heard the same voices himself. A faithful steward of the creative life force, a generative man never engages in a wanton destruction. He is not indifferent to the plight of the oppressed. He is vitally concerned about the rights, safety, health, and material prosperity of all human beings. Beyond this, he is interested in the welfare of the ecosystem as a whole. Though he may be a master at utilizing the physical environment for the benefit of his family, his nation, or all humankind, he honors both technology and the environment in a balanced way. He encourages the harmonious interaction between society and nature. He is neither the enemy of science and industry, nor an irresponsible dumper of toxic wastes. He seeks the middle path, which is responsible to immediate and to long-range human needs and to his planetary home. The generative man vigorously pursues the extension of the created order against the forces of destruction and death. There are many facets of these forces: drugs, racism, classism, nationalism, religionism, poverty, child abuse, spouse abuse, petty quarreling, ignorance, egotistic power-grabbing, and environmental pollution, political and economic depression, and all are expressions of human chaos. Their ultimate effect is always the destruction of global well-being. A generative man is concerned with law and order wherever the law and order contribute to the flourishing of human beings. He is a protector of the weak and disempowered. He does what he can in order to assure justice and equality of opportunity for all people. The man who can access the archetypal king is a reconciler of opposites. He listens for what truths are spoken on all sides of a dispute. He looks beneath the surface arguments to the fear and anguish of the child within. He addresses this deeper reality when he speaks to each of the opposing sides. While he prefers diplomatic solutions, where destructive impulses need subduing, he acts swiftly and decisively to reestablish order out of his own sense of integrity. Even when others grumble about his severity, they know that he is just. Everyone knows the difference between men in leadership positions who are firm because they are genuinely interested in our welfare, and men who are severe out of their own grandiosity. A generative man is able to help us subdue our own self-destructiveness, and for this we deeply appreciate him. Self-sacrifice is an inescapable part of world building, something this man realizes. The generative man gives his life's blood for the people and causes entrusted into him. His hard work and personal sacrifice provision others, and advance the generativity of the world. He spends as much of his life and energy as he can to help others build their worlds. At the same time, he is no martyr or masochist. He cares for his own welfare, only choosing to sacrifice himself because of his sense of an abundant and replenishable self-worth. He volunteers in causes that awaken both his compassion and his just anger. In these and other ways, a generative man provisions the world. Like the sacred king of the Far East, the generative man works toward harmony and order in his own inner life. He views setting his own house in order as a prerequisite for helping others and others order their own lives. He is relentlessly honest with himself about his failings. He takes his share of responsibility when things go badly, but no more and no less than his share. Out of his empowering stance, he is able to do something positive and concrete about the problem that confronts him. He may be involved in some form of psychotherapeutic process. He knows that where his integrity is at stake, one way or another, he must work to develop his own psychological and spiritual life. He is open to criticisms, for he realizes that they will usually hold some truths. He is not, however, a misguided moral perfectionist. Rather, he urgently engages himself in a quest for wholeness and moral seriousness. Out of his deep loyalty to himself, the generative man is able to be loyal to others, his family and friends, his company and any voluntary organizations he may be fostering, his community and his nation, and ultimately his world. These loyalties may at times be at odds with each other and set up intense conflicts within him. To the extent, however, that a man can be generative, his loyalty will be to the greatest good for the greatest number. His loyalty in the end will be a transpersonal other, that is, deeply compatible with his own sense of self. Finally, the generative man has achieved a rich masculine identity both by building his inner masculine structures and by valuing his inner feminine characteristics. He has come to know the mystery that his masculinity is enhanced to the extent that he is appreciative of his anima. He has experienced within himself the sacred marriage of the king with his queen. Full generativity, he realizes, in psychospiritual affairs, just as surely as in biological ones, is possibly only where the masculine and feminine energies are united. He is almost certainly sexually active and eager for intimate relationship with a partner as capable of intimacy as he is. Together they may generate and nurture children. If not, their energies combine in more subtle but still tangibly creative ways. Protector, provider, procreator, a generative man is a center for world building, an axis mundi around which others may rally. At his center, he is unassailable. He provides stability to his inner world and to others who come to him looking for order in themselves. His own opposite impulses are reconciled at his center, and through his experience of this, he helps others to do the same. As a transformer, he makes usable the creative life force he carries within him. Others draw from him a sense of their own empowerment. He may be a procreator in the specific sense of fathering children he cares for and teaches. Certainly he is a procreator in the broad sense of initiating creative advance in the world he has been given to steward. He is a structurer, establishing calm in the midst of chaos, facilitating order through determined action. He is committed to the preservation and the extension of a civilized, yet vigorously instinctual way of life. In these ways he incarnates the potential in the actual, the sacred in the profane. He is an image of the mature masculinity towards which we all strive.